Victorian era living was all sorts of wild for women. Today we've got all sorts of weird beauty trends to break down, along with modesty regulations and calling hours 101, oh and more. Question for you, what do you think would have made life impossible for you in the Victorian era? Let me know in the comments and let's get into it. So nowadays, folks like myself wear shades of black as a form of self-expression, just loving how it looks, so forth, so on. Traditionally speaking, most folks from older generations associate it with funeral reasons. Well, as it turns out, as well as mourning loved ones, there was another more practical reason why so many Victorians wore a lot of black. It was all down to pollution. Industry was booming in the Victorian era, and pollution was kind of a big thing, particularly in the cities, meaning women who wore light colors would find their dresses turning shades of grey. So they opted for darker clothing because icky. So how did black become associated with mourning rules? Well, it's well documented that when Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, she went into mourning and wore black until her death 40 years later. During that time, she secluded herself from the rest of the world and was rarely seen in public, earning herself the name Widow of Windsor. But did you know she actually disliked wearing black at funerals, and at her own funeral ensured the streets of London were decorated in purple and white? Neat little funeral rules. So back when being a lady of the house was a big job, part of that job involved entertaining callers, or guests. So if a lady was at home during the day, she was expected to be properly dressed and prepared for visitors between the hours of 3 to 5 p.m. The time visitors could arrive was dependent on how familiar and acquaintance they were, with closer friends and family permitted to visit later in the day. It would have been seen as poor taste for me to arrive earlier than 3 p.m. You wouldn't stay long, and if someone else would arrive while you were there, you'd leave gracefully. I'm not done with crazy clothing rules yet. Modesty was kind of a big deal during the Victorian era. Obviously, not so much of a thing anymore, but still very important back then. At the time, a lady would not wear a skirt that showed her ankles. By that, let me explain. It would have been inappropriate for anyone of the genteel class, man or woman mind you, to show any part of their leg without a stocking. However, lifting one's skirts to expose the stocking-footed ankle was quite common. After all, it would have been dangerous to ascend stairs or enter a carriage without arranging one's skirts to do so. We don't want anybody tripping. Nobody dying. Queen Victoria had long, beautiful hair, and back in the day she couldn't just run to a CVS and pick up whatever formula would work best to tame it. Thankfully, she had a royal advisor and was told to dilute pure ammonia in warm water and then massage it through the scalp and hair, like modern shampoo. But as one modern expert points out, working with ammonia was quite a bit more dangerous than just getting a couple of drops of shampoo in your eyes. Ammonia becomes highly corrosive when reacting to water, which would probably be very effective at stripping hair of grime. Also, skin. Couple of layers there. Some women would actually wash their faces with ammonia, and there's no way that sensation felt good. If you were skeptical of ammonia and had good sense, you could always reach for an alternative: onion juice. It didn't necessarily work to cleanse the hair of grease, but it was believed, at least by some, to make hair long and shiny. Of course, onion juice stinks, but it's safer than ammonia. The use of excessive makeup in the Victorian age was viewed as promiscuous and would only really be seen on performers or women of the night. A pure natural face, free from blemishes, freckles, or marks, was considered beautiful. However, that didn't mean women didn't secretly concoct their own remedies and cosmetics to enhance features and hide imperfections. One of the most important features to a woman in the Victorian era was to have the most translucent, pale complexion that was possible. A fair and healthy complexion distinguished a woman's social status. A lady of higher social standing would use accessories like gloves and umbrellas to protect her from the environment, and those unlucky to be born with freckles were advised to rinse their faces in lemon juice, or in more stubborn cases, rub the skin with carbolic acid, or sit in the sun until the freckles burned off. And if premature wrinkles resulted from these harsh so-called cures, young women might look to the habits of their older relatives and do some other things that we'll get to later. Turns out sleeping with any animal fat on the skin, sheep's fat, veal, lard, was apparently great for you. Societal women did not want it known that they wore cosmetics, so their beauty rituals were not publicized or discussed. Cold cream, consisting of water, oil, emulsifier, and thickening agent, became a staple in the beauty rituals of Victorian women. It was believed that cold cream is beneficial for cleansing the skin and providing a moisturizing effect, and so the cream was essential to Victorian women who wanted to maintain very soft, delicate skin. It was one of the only products in the era that was fairly safe to use and not looked down upon. It's still used to this day. When I say the phrase crotchless underwear, I'm sure some folks are picturing something very naughty, and I'm sure some lovely editor somewhere is screaming, because that's something that's not usually PG. But what if I told you it could be? The base layer of a lot of Victorian women's outfits was a pair of long bloomers that were designed only to cover each leg, not the unmentionables. This was to allow women to use the toilet more easily, and also because dresses were so heavy and made up of several layers, so that kept everything hidden. So long story short, Victorian hoo-has had a direct line of sight to the floor. Lots of breathing. So one more thing about skincare, because I kind of glossed over it earlier. One beauty advice writer instructed women to bind the head every night with thin slices of raw beef, which was said to keep the skin from wrinkles and give a youthful freshness to the complexion. Well, if your dog didn't eat your face in your sleep, of course, because dogs were kind of running around aplenty in Victorian castles. When it came to hairstyling, that was also a whole can of worms. I know I mentioned a bit before, but let's get back to it. In the Victorian era, a woman's hair was thought to be one of her most valuable assets, and styles varied quite a bit throughout the nearly 7 decades of Queen Victoria's reign, with everything from simple middle parts to elaborate pieces made from human hair being in fashion. Hair was long in the Victorian age, extremely long. Haircuts weren't really a thing for women. They did occasionally trim split ends, sometimes they singed them, but long hair was viewed as being ultra feminine and desirable. Long hair styled in an updo was the way most women, especially upper class women, wore their hair during this time. So, how would we do fun things? Well, women kept hair receivers on their dressing tables, which is basically a covered bowl with a removable lid which has a hole in the top. When the hair is brushed, the hair that comes out and is left on the brush is stuffed into the hair receiver. When enough hair has been collected and saved, it's made into a rat, which is a rolled hairpiece used to pad and bolster up the fullness of the hair by inserting it underneath the style, and you secure it with pins or combs. Think of it as an old-fashioned bump it. So this next segment is technically not a rule, but something more a normal part of society. There's something kind of rich and romantic about the Victorians and their substance use. The works of Thomas de Quincey, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Charles Dickens all owe more than a little to potent things that were freely available in their time. For example, Thomas de Quincey, in his work Confessions of an English Opium Eater, states that a philosopher who takes said thing will experience a phantasmagoria of dreams. The 19th century was a crucial period of substance-taking development, both in terms of potency and plurality. The Victorians took not just like booze and opes, but Mary Jane, coca, mezcal, and with the invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1840s, morphine and spicy spoon juice. This time period also saw the origins of substance control and the medicalization of addiction to these substances. Dinah Birch looks at what these substances meant in the context of society, and part of this was an inclination to sensation seeking. The high from successes and the high of substances were partners in pleasure. To quote the 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke, under the pressure of the cares and sorrows of our mortal condition, folks have at all times called in some physical aid to their consolations. The Victorians were not unique in their interests, but how important this ingestion was to their culture and the promotion of these things by industry, particularly the still legal tobacco, tea, coffee, and booze industries, kind of cemented at this time. A serious scientific culture developed towards the middle of the 19th century that kind of led to self-experimentation. And finally, we might as well end today with the same thing we started with, and that's mourning standards. The Victorian women took mourning very seriously. They often wore mourning rings, which were made from dark gems, and they also featured hair from a deceased person. Some folks would bottle their mourning tears. We've all heard about hair flower art. Often, some women were hired to stand at a bachelor's gravesite. Why? Well, to cry inconsolably so that he seemed adored. So, could that still be a thing? Maybe. Alrighty folks, that's it for me once again. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.